Release my people. 3 straightforward words altered history's trajectory and established the foundation for one of Scripture's most remarkable chronicles. This evening, as you prepare for slumber, I will guide you through Exodus in its entirety, from the flame-filled shrub to the commandments on stone tablets, from the extraordinary afflictions to the desert wanderings. So settle into your cushion, let your eyelids fall, and permit this timeless account of liberation, devotion, and heavenly guidance to ease you toward restful sleep. Before settling in completely, think about leaving a like and subscribing if you have not done so yet. This supports other seeking minds in discovering their way to us. Additionally, share with us your listening location and the current hour. Now, without additional delay, shall we commence? Part 1. Establishing the Foundation. A realm of sand and covenant. In the earliest times, a covenant existed, an agreement forged between a wandering patriarch and the presence that summoned him from beneath the celestial expanse. Abraham, traveler of territories, departed from his city carrying nothing except conviction and the grit of pathways upon his feet. The covenant shadowed his journey persistently. Offspring countless as the heavenly lights, territory abundant with nourishment and sweetness. And through his bloodline, every nation would receive blessing. From Abraham emerged Isaac, offspring of joy and willing sacrifice. Yet from Isaac emerged Jacob, the one who wrestled heavenly messengers, whose identity transformed to Israel, one who contends with the divine. And from Jacob emerged 12 male heirs, 12 tribal divisions, the cornerstones of a nation awaiting birth. Within this group of sons stood Joseph, betrayed by his own siblings, sold into Egyptian captivity, only to ascend from prison depths to royal chambers through Providence's enigmatic operations. Egypt during that era towered as a giant among civilizations. While neighboring territories withered from drought and hunger, the Nile's dependable flooding guaranteed Egypt's storage facilities stayed abundant. Amber grain fields extended toward distant horizons. Sacred structures of stunning magnitude reached skyward, and a refined society thrived beneath the observant attention of pharaohs who governed as divine incarnations. Into this prosperous territory arrived Jacob alongside his household, 70 individuals total, welcomed by Joseph, presently Egypt's chief administrator, throughout a period of severe scarcity. The abundant territory of Goshen transformed into their dwelling place. There, beneath Egypt's shelter, Israel's descendants flourished and increased. Their animal herds multiplied extensively. Their offspring occupied the dwellings, and their existence in the territory became advantageous precisely as had been guaranteed to their ancestor. One generation succeeded another. Joseph aged and perished, his remains meticulously maintained in expectation of eventual return to the covenant territory. His siblings likewise departed into remembrance. The accounts of their beginnings, of agreements established beneath starlight, and guarantees pronounced from flame-filled vegetation, transformed into evening murmurs transferred from elder to youngster. Time progressed. The Nile ascended and descended in its timeless pattern, and Israel's offspring prospered throughout the Delta territories. Yet abundance occasionally sows anxiety's seeds within wary souls. The Egyptians, who initially received these outsiders, commenced observing their expansion with apprehension. Their population had swelled from simple dozens to thousands upon thousands. The fabric shelters of their settlement extended across visible distances. Thus occurred that blessing's abundance transformed into attention's burden, and servitude's darkness commenced extending across their tomorrow. A shadow not yet recognized as sunshine persisted, illuminating their prosperity. Part 2. A different Pharaoh. A different anxiety. Time moves like the Nile, steady, relentless, sweeping yesterday's memories downstream. Multiple generations elapsed in Egypt until the moment arrived when a different pharaoh claimed the throne of the dual territories, one whose training and upbringing contained zero recollection of Joseph or the preservation he delivered to Egypt throughout famine years. This Pharaoh surveyed his domain with evaluating vision and perceived not visitors or valuable members, but threatening adversaries. "Observe," he addressed his counselors, assembling them near within pillar-lined chambers of decorated limestone. "These individuals, these Hebrews, expand too abundantly for reassurance. They reproduce more rapidly than our native population. Should conflict arrive at our frontiers, what prevents them from aligning with our adversaries and battling against us? What halts them from merely departing the territory, removing their expertise and effort alongside them? Anxiety serves as cruelty's powerful designer. The Pharaoh's apprehension constructed oppression's structure. Stone by methodically positioned stone. Initially arrived the work assignments. The Israelites designated to labor details, construction endeavors, agricultural work, their powerful backs curved beneath stone and bricks burden, transporting materials for the magnificent storage settlements of Pithom and Ramesses. What commenced as occasional labor transformed into perpetual servitude. Supervisors materialized with leather straps and record-keeping, demanding portions of brick and binding material. The pleasant existence in Goshen altered season by season into exhausting difficulty. Still beneath oppression's burden, Israel's offspring persisted in thriving. Every generation appeared more abundant than the previous, their energy undiminished through hardship. The Pharaoh's annoyance expanded like distant storm clouds. "Increase their labor's intensity," he instructed his supervisors. "Allow them to locate their own straw for the bricks, yet maintain the portion unchanged. Occupy their days with such toil that strength for reproduction remains absent." The leather straps struck more forcefully. The sun scorched more intensely on curved spines. The clay excavations and brick kilns transformed into suffering locations where Hebrew workers labored from sunrise until stellar emergence. Still, their population expanded as though adversity itself fortified their physical forms and determination. The Pharaoh's anxiety intensified into calculated, frigid fury. If subjugation failed to halt their expansion, perhaps elimination would succeed. The royal command dispersed like toxin. Every Hebrew male infant born requires drowning in the Nile. Female children might survive, for they could integrate into Egyptian dwellings or become household workers, yet sons represented threatening future power of internal enemies. The midwives attending Hebrew mothers received direct orders, instructed to transform into infanticide instruments. Yet these women, Shifra and Puah, their identities preserved in remembrance when royal names dissolved to powder, respected God above Pharaoh. They discovered methods for disobedience, asserting Hebrew mothers delivered too swiftly for their timely arrival. Lullabies in Hebrew dwellings transformed into whispered, desperate prayers. Mothers delivered in silence, suppressing their sounds, preventing soldiers from hearing and investigating. Every newborn's initial breath arrived as simultaneous miracle and peril. Along the Nile shorelines, where existence had prospered for these temporary residents, now concealed shadows of unspeakable tragedy. Egypt's waterway, previously the wellspring of their abundance, transformed into a flowing burial place for the smallest and most defenseless. Israel's offspring, previously welcomed visitors in an abundant territory, had transformed into a captive population, their very survival considered threatening to the empire that initially received them. Part 3. The reed vessel in the papyrus. In a modest dwelling constructed of mud, brick, and papyrus, with barriers sufficiently thin that supervisors' commands could penetrate like blades, a male child was delivered to a woman from Levi's tribe. Her spouse Amram originated from the identical tribe, and they possessed 2 children already, a female child called Miriam, and a male child, Aaron. This woman, Jochebed, observed her newborn with a mother's passionate devotion and the tormented recognition that his very survival was prohibited. Still, something regarding this infant captured her breath. An exceptional characteristic, a radiance in his gaze, a destiny's sense that murmured to her spirit. For 3 valuable months, she achieved the impossible. She muffled his sounds with swift hands and soft melodies, provided nourishment in darkness, and concealed him whenever danger approached. Every external sound sent terror coursing through her veins. Every footfall might belong to those who would steal her infant away. Yet an infant's development cannot remain hidden indefinitely. His sounds intensified, his movements more energetic. The day Jochebed feared ultimately arrived. The day concealing him at home became unfeasible. Desperate creativity visited her during the silent hours preceding dawn. If the Pharaoh had ordered that every Hebrew male be thrown into the Nile, she would comply, yet on her conditions. With shaking hands, yet determined spirit, she wove a compact vessel from papyrus reeds, the identical plant that supplied the Egyptians with writing material and cordage. She coated it meticulously with tar and sticky pitch, rendering it watertight, not a burial container, but a rescue vessel, a deliverance craft comparable in intention, if not in dimension, to the one that rescued Noah's household generations previously. When the vessel was finished, Jochebed wrapped her male child in cloth, pressed a final kiss upon his brow, and positioned him in this delicate craft. Before the sun had completely emerged, while vapor still adhered to the waterway's surface, she transported her treasured cargo to the Nile, not to the primary flow where it would sweep away, but to a peaceful location where reeds expanded densely along the shoreline, to the location where she understood the royal household's women arrived to cleanse themselves. She positioned the vessel carefully among the reeds, observing it settle into the gradual current without floating away. Maintain distance, she instructed Miriam, her female child. Observe and witness what occurs with him, the girl acknowledged, her youthful face grave with comprehension beyond her years. She hid herself among the waterside vegetation, vision never departing the compact ark containing her sibling. The morning intensified. The vapor evaporated beneath the Egyptian sun. Then arrived the sound of voices, bright and melodic, accompanied by the soft clatter of adornments and the rustle of quality linen. The Pharaoh's female offspring approached with her servants, pursuing shelter from the day's intensifying heat in the Nile's cool waters. Her vision, trained through a lifetime of royal training to recognize what others overlooked, detected the unusual sight among the reeds, a deliberate vessel clearly positioned with purpose rather than abandoned through accident. "Retrieve that for me," she ordered, and a servant waded into the shallows to collect it. As the vessel was positioned before her, the princess opened it personally. Inside rested the infant, vision wide and dark, observing her with a gaze that appeared to hold enigmas. Then, as though comprehending his precarious situation, the infant commenced crying. A sound of such innocent defenselessness that it pierced through royal detachment and diplomatic caution. "This is among the Hebrew infants," the princess whispered. Recognition instantaneous. Her father's command was understood throughout the palace, its harshness discussed in whispers among the royal women. Still observing the infant before her, she experienced not the separation of state policy, yet the awakening of sympathy. Observing from her hidden position, Miriam assembled her bravery and approached the royal group. "Shall I proceed and summon a nurse from the Hebrew women to provide nourishment for the infant on your behalf?" she inquired, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. The princess, perhaps recognizing the connection, yet selecting not to acknowledge it, simply nodded her agreement. Thus occurred that Jochebed received her male child back into her embrace, not as a fugitive, yet beneath royal shelter, assigned to provide nourishment and care for him until he was weaned. "You shall receive payment for your service," the princess informed her. Unaware, she addressed the infant's biological mother. When the boy matured and was delivered to the palace, the princess named him Moses, signifying drawn out, stating, "Because I extracted him from the water." Thus, Moses entered dual worlds simultaneously. Delivered of Hebrew captives, still raised in Pharaoh's palace, nourished on his mother's sustenance, still educated by Egypt's premier scholars, connected to his people's suffering, still privileged with royalty's luxury. In his divided existence rested destiny's seeds that would transform nations' trajectory. Part 4. Escape into the desert. Years elapsed like shadows across the desert surface. Moses developed from infant to adolescent to adult within the protected confines of the royal palace. Egyptian instructors taught him inscription and calculation, construction and celestial observation, the governance craft, and the diplomatic skills. He achieved excellence in all these domains. Gifted with both intelligence and royal patronage's advantage, still beneath the refined exterior of an Egyptian nobleman beat a Hebrew infant's spirit. The early years with his biological mother had left a permanent impression. Whispered accounts of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of guarantees and agreements of a God dissimilar to the multitude of deities worshipped in Egypt's sacred structures. Though raised in privilege, Moses carried an awareness that prevented genuine peace. From palace openings, he could observe his people laboring distantly, spines curved beneath burdens he had never carried. This understanding created internal tension that intensified with each passing year. He belonged everywhere and nowhere. Too Hebrew for the Egyptians, too Egyptian for the Hebrews. A connection between realms that neither faction had requested. One day, when Moses had achieved complete masculine strength, he ventured outward to observe the Hebrew workers directly. Perhaps he pursued connection, perhaps comprehension, perhaps some resolution to the conflict dividing his identity. What he discovered instead was brutality exposed. An Egyptian supervisor beating a Hebrew captive with methodical harshness. The man's leather strap rose and descended in a pattern as ancient as subjugation itself. Something ignited in Moses' blood at the sight. Fury, indeed, yet also recognition. The individual beneath the lash was not merely a captive, yet a kinsman. Moses glanced in all directions. A lifetime of palace prudence not entirely abandoned. Perceiving no observers, he acted with the decisive violence of one familiar with authority. The supervisor fell beneath his hands, existence departing with startling swiftness. With hurried movements born of sudden fear, Moses interred the body in the sand, the desert becoming accomplice in his secret. He returned to the palace with blood on his hands and disturbance in his soul, believing his action concealed from all vision. Yet secrets rarely remain interred, particularly in a society constructed on the observant hierarchies of authority. The very following day, Moses witnessed two Hebrew men fighting among themselves, perhaps pursuing to establish his connection with his people, perhaps attempting to compensate for violence with justice. He approached them. "Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" he inquired the aggressor. The man's response struck Moses like a physical impact. "Who appointed you a nobleman and a judge over us? Do you intend to eliminate me as you eliminated the Egyptian?" The words descended like stones into motionless water, implication ripples extending outward. If this Hebrew worker understood what Moses had done, how long before others understood? How long before the Pharaoh himself discovered that his adopted descendant had eliminated an Egyptian supervisor to shelter a Hebrew captive? Anxiety replaced fury in Moses' spirit. The palace that had been his dwelling suddenly appeared as perilous as a predator's den. When word of the death reached the Pharaoh, his response was rapid and foreseeable. Moses, nobleman though he might be, favored by the princess though he was, had committed an unpardonable transgression. The sentence was elimination. Warned perhaps by sympathizers within the court, Moses escaped before royal protectors could capture him. He ran as one runs from certain elimination, with determination, desperation, and no rearward glance, away from the Nile's abundant valley, away from the only dwelling he had understood as an adult, into the desert's harsh embrace. The wilderness opened before him like a pitiless invitation. Sand replaced the refined surfaces beneath his feet. Scorching wind replaced the refreshing breezes of palace gardens. Moses followed trading routes eastward, pushing his body beyond exhaustion, sleeping in shallow caverns or beneath the frigid stars. His journey transported him to Midian, a tribal territory east of Egypt, where Abraham's descendants through his secondary wife Keturah had settled generations earlier. There, exhausted to the bone and parched with thirst, Moses rested beside a well, that most valuable of desert landmarks. As he sat gathering his strength, 7 sisters approached with their father's animals, pursuing to water the creatures. No sooner had they commenced drawing water than local herders arrived, attempting to expel the women away and claim the well for themselves. An ancient account of strength imposing itself upon perceived weakness. Moses, though distant from dwelling and stripped of position, retained the moral compass that had led him to defend the beaten captive. He rose to his feet, confronted the herders, and expelled them away, then assisted the sisters water their animals. This kindness action led to an invitation to the dwelling of their father, Reuel, also called Jethro, priest of Midian. In this simple dwelling, so different from the palaces of his youth, Moses discovered refuge and eventually a different existence. Jethro gave Moses his female offspring Zipporah in marriage, and she delivered him a male child named Gershom, signifying sojourner. For as Moses stated, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign territory." He settled into nomadic existence's rhythms, learning to tend animals rather than review architectural plans, to track desert water sources rather than navigate court politics. Years elapsed in relative tranquility. The former nobleman became a herder, walking the lonely places where few men ventured, leading sheep to sparse grazing and protected waters. Egypt and its painful memories receded like a troubling dream at dawn. Still destiny, once initiated, rarely remains inactive forever. The seeds planted in Moses' divided childhood, Hebrew spirit, Egyptian education, awareness of injustice, capacity for decisive action, remained alive beneath the surface, awaiting only the proper moment to sprout into something world-transforming. Part 5. The flame-filled shrub. Distant from the mud-brick villages of Goshen and the alabaster palaces of the pharaohs, Moses settled into the measured rhythm of a herder's existence. Days dissolved into months, months into years, until 4 decades had elapsed since his escape from Egypt. His hands, previously soft from palace living, developed calluses from the herder's rod. His skin darkened beneath the desert sun to the deep bronze of Midianite nomads. Only his vision, still containing flashes of the education and awareness of his youth, hinted at a past different from the existence he presently lived. Sheep transformed into his companions. Their soft bleating and gentle movements, a stark contrast to the rigid formality of court existence. He learned their individual characteristics, their habits and requirements. He studied the sparse vegetation of the wilderness, finding concealed grazing where others perceived only desolation. He memorized the locations of springs and seasonal water sources, plotting his journeys to sustain his animals through drought and scarcity. One day, guiding his sheep through the wilderness, Moses approached the foundation of a mountain known as Horeb, the mountain of the divine, as it would later be designated. Perhaps he pursued new grazing for his animals. Perhaps water collected in rocky crevices. Whatever his practical intention, what awaited him transcended the ordinary concerns of herding. Among the sparse vegetation and sun-bleached rocks, a shrub captured his attention, not for its dimension or location, yet for an impossible contradiction. The shrub burned with flames, bright and undeniable. Still, it was not consumed. No branches blackened, no foliage curled to ash. The fire burned without destroying. Moses turned aside from his path, drawn by primal curiosity toward this marvel. "I must turn aside to observe this great sight," he murmured to himself. "Why the shrub is not burned." As he approached, a voice called from within the flames, speaking his identity twice with recognition's intensity. "Moses, Moses." The herder stopped, suddenly aware that he stood on the threshold of something far beyond normal experience. "Here I am," he answered. The simple response of one acknowledging a summons. "Do not approach near," the voice commanded from within the unconsumed flames. "Remove your footwear from your feet, for the location on which you are standing is holy ground." Moses complied with trembling hands, feeling the hot sand against his bare soles, a physical reminder of his vulnerability before this manifestation. "I am the God of your father," continued the voice, "the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At these words, Moses concealed his face, suddenly afraid to gaze upon even the flame-filled shrub that contained such presence. This was not one of Egypt's numerous deities with their animal heads and human bodies, not one of Midian's local gods concerned with wells and grazing territories. This was the God of his ancestors, the one his mother had whispered about during his earliest years. "I have surely observed the affliction of my people who are in Egypt," the voice continued, each word descending like fire into Moses' consciousness. "I have heard their cry because of their supervisors. I understand their sufferings, and I have descended to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them upward from that territory to a good and broad territory, a territory flowing with nourishment and sweetness." The voice from the shrub spoke of locations and individuals Moses had struggled to forget for 40 years. Egypt with its subjugation, the Hebrews with their suffering, the supervisors with their leather straps. Each word reopened wounds he had thought long healed, awakening memories deliberately interred beneath decades of desert silence. "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, Israel's offspring, from Egypt." The command hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, still equally impossible to embrace. The herder, who had previously been a nobleman, stood transfixed between his past and a future suddenly, terrifyingly open before him. "Who am I that I should proceed to Pharaoh and bring Israel's offspring from Egypt?" Moses inquired, his voice small against the vastness of the task proposed. "I who escaped as a murderer, I who have transformed into a simple tender of sheep, how could I stand before Egypt's throne and demand anything? I will be with you," arrived the answer, simple, still profound in its assurance. "And this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people from Egypt, you shall serve the divine on this mountain." Still Moses hesitated, practical concerns rising to mask deeper anxieties. "If I arrive to Israel's offspring and declare to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they inquire of me, 'What is his identity?' what shall I tell them?" The shrub burned brighter, its flames seeming to reach higher without consuming the desert shrub. "I am who I am," declared the voice. "Say this to Israel's offspring, 'I am has sent me to you.'" The voice continued with deliberate gravity. "The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my identity forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations." In those moments beside the flame-filled shrub, Moses received not only an identity, yet a mission. He was to return to Egypt, the territory of his birth and the territory of his crime, and confront the most powerful ruler in the known realm. He was to declare freedom for a people who had understood only captivity for generations. He was to lead them across deserts and perils toward a guaranteed territory he himself had never observed. The herder stood barefoot on holy ground, caught between anxiety and calling, between the comfortable familiarity of his quiet existence and the disruptive voice of divine intention. The shrub continued to burn, patient and persistent, awaiting his answer. An ordinary shrub made extraordinary by the presence it contained, much like the ordinary man standing before it, trembling on transformation's edge. Part 6. Return to Egypt. Moses sat beneath an ancient acacia tree's shade, his weathered hands gripping the herder's rod that had transformed into an extension of himself over 40 years in Midian. The flame-filled shrub encounter lingered in his mind, like lightning's afterglow against a night sky. How could he, a man with hesitant speech and more hesitant bravery, stand before the mightiest ruler in the known realm? The very thought sent tremors through his callous hands. The desert wind whispered across the rolling dunes as Moses gazed toward the horizon where Egypt rested. His existence had discovered rhythm here among the Midianites with his wife Zipporah and their male children. The animals knew his voice. The desert paths knew his footsteps. Still the divine had spoken, and those words' burden pressed upon him with each passing moment. "I will be with you," the voice had guaranteed from the unconsumed flames. Still doubt adhered to him like shadow at dusk. That night, as stars pierced the velvet darkness, Moses shared his burden with Zipporah. Her vision, dark and steady as the night itself, held his gaze. "The divine who summons provides the path," she whispered. Together they assembled their few possessions, prepared their offspring, and made ready for the journey that would transform history's shape. Word arrived from the mountain that Aaron, Moses' kinsman, whom he had not observed in decades, was journeying to meet him. The divine had spoken to Aaron as well, sending him into the wilderness to discover his long-lost brother. When they met on the dusty path near the divine's mountain, they embraced with the wordless comprehension of blood reunited. Moses' tongue, so hesitant before the flame-filled shrub, loosened as he shared with Aaron every detail of the divine's commission. Aaron's vision grew wide with wonder as Moses recounted the miraculous signs the divine had given. The rod transformed to serpent, the hand turned leprous, then restored, the guarantee of water transforming to blood. "I will be your voice," Aaron assured his kinsman, "and you will be as the divine to me, putting the words in my mouth." In this partnership, Moses discovered bravery stirring within his reluctant spirit. They journeyed together toward Egypt, two elderly men walking the ancient trade routes with nothing except a wooden rod and divine guarantees. The same stars that had witnessed Abraham's journey presently watched over his descendants returning to confront empire with covenant. At night, they spoke in hushed tones of what awaited. The elders of Israel who required convincing, the masses broken by generations of captivity, and Pharaoh himself, divine monarch of the most powerful civilization on earth. As they crossed the frontier into Egypt, the landscape transformed from sparse wilderness to the abundant black soil of the delta. The atmosphere grew thick with humidity rising from the Nile, carrying the scent of river mud, growing crops, and humanity's press. Moses experienced memory's burden as they passed fields where countless Hebrews curved beneath the Egyptian supervisor's gaze, their bodies glistening with sweat beneath the pitiless sun. Initially, they assembled Israel's elders, those weathered leaders who had preserved hope through darkening decades of captivity. In a shadowed corner away from Egyptian vision, Moses and Aaron spoke of encounters with their father's divine. Aaron performed the signs while Moses explained the divine plan of deliverance. When the rod writhed as serpent upon the ground, gasps rippled through the gathering. When Moses showed his hand restored from leprosy, tears streamed down lined faces. "The Lord has indeed remembered us," they whispered, bowing their heads in worship. Hope, that delicate flame so nearly extinguished by generations of captivity, flickered anew among the Hebrews. Word spread through the mud-brick dwellings of Goshen. Abraham's divine had sent a deliverer. After 400 years of silence, heaven had spoken again. The guarantee had not been forgotten. Moses slept fitfully that night, his dreams filled with palace corridors he had previously walked as nobleman, presently to be traversed as prophet. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would initiate either deliverance or deeper despair. As dawn broke over the Nile, turning its waters to molten gold, Moses and Aaron rose, grasped the miraculous rod, and directed their faces toward Pharaoh's palace. The journey back to Egypt was complete. The greater journey was just beginning. Part 7. Release my people. The royal palace of Ramesses rose like a mountain of gleaming limestone against the azure Egyptian sky. Massive pillars adorned with lotus blossoms supported ceilings decorated with stars and birds in flight. Moses, who had previously called these halls dwelling, presently walked them as an outsider, his herder's garments stark against the refined elegance of court. Beside him, Aaron clutched the wooden rod, his knuckles white with tension. Protectors with spears and suspicious vision flanked them on either side. Court officials whispered behind their hands as the two elderly Hebrews passed. Some recognized Moses despite the decades and the gray beard that presently framed his face. The returned nobleman, they murmured. The murderer who escaped. Moses maintained his gaze forward, experiencing his past's burden with every step on the refined surface. The throne room opened before them, vast and imposing. Golden light filtered through alabaster openings, illuminating a space designed to humble all who entered. At its center sat Pharaoh, adorned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. The crook and flail crossed upon his chest, his vision lined with kohl and narrowed with disdain. This was not the Pharaoh of Moses' youth, yet a successor who understood nothing of Joseph's contributions or the debt Egypt owed to Hebrew wisdom. Court protocols demanded prostration, yet Moses and Aaron merely bowed their heads in modest respect. This subtle defiance did not go unnoticed. A ripple of discomfort passed through the assembled officials. Moses experienced his heart pounding in his chest, yet discovered his voice steady as Aaron spoke the words they had rehearsed. Thus declares the Lord, Israel's divine, release my people, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. Silence descended across the vast chamber. Pharaoh's expression shifted from surprise to amusement to frigid fury. Who is this Lord that I should comply with his voice and release Israel? He demanded, his voice echoing against marble walls. I do not understand the Lord, nor will I release Israel. The rejection hung in the atmosphere like incense's scent, sharp and pervasive. Moses stepped forward then, discovering bravery in the remembrance of the flame-filled shrub. Through Aaron, he explained their request more completely. A 3-day journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to their divine, lest he fall upon them with disease or sword. Pharaoh's vision narrowed further. Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people from their labor? Get back to your work, he commanded, glancing toward the Hebrew representatives who stood trembling at the chamber's edges. Before they were dismissed, Pharaoh turned to his administrators with a harsh smile. You shall no longer supply the people straw to make brick as before. Allow them to proceed and gather straw for themselves, and the portion of bricks which they made before, you shall impose on them. You shall not reduce it. As they departed the palace, Moses experienced failure's burden pressing on his shoulders. The golden light of Egypt presently appeared to mock the divine guarantee. Aaron's steps beside him were heavy with shared disappointment. They had arrived with the divine's word only to depart with a heavier burden placed upon their people. Word spread quickly through Goshen. That very afternoon, Egyptian supervisors and Hebrew foremen were summoned together and informed of the new decree. Thus declares Pharaoh, I will not supply you straw. The foremen's faces fell as they realized what this signified. The identical portion of bricks, yet presently with the added labor of gathering scattered straw from harvested fields, the impossible had transformed into more impossible. Still, the Hebrew people scattered throughout the territory, gathering stubble instead of straw. Offspring, as young as 5 years old, joined the desperate search, their small fingers bloodied by the sharp edges of cut stalks. Still they fell short of their portions. The supervisor's leather straps cracked across the Hebrew foremen's backs. Why have you not fulfilled your task in making brick both yesterday and today as before? These foremen, discovering zero mercy from their Egyptian masters, pursued audience with Pharaoh himself. Desperate and broken, they pleaded their case, yet discovered only scorn. Departing the palace, they encountered Moses and Aaron waiting to hear news of their appeal. Their despair turned to bitter fury. May the Lord observe you and judge, they cried, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, putting a sword in their hand to eliminate us. Moses, devastated by the suffering he appeared to have caused, turned away from the accusing vision of his own people and pursued solitude to wrestle with the divine. Beneath the darkening sky, he poured out his anguish. Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why is it you have sent me? For since I arrived to Pharaoh to speak in your identity, He has done evil to this people. Neither have you delivered your people at all." The night grew deeper around his bowed figure, as tears carved paths down his weathered face. The guarantee of deliverance presently appeared like a harsh illusion, leading not to freedom, yet to deeper suffering. Still in that darkness, the voice that had spoken from the shrub would speak again, renewing the covenant and the calling that had brought him back to Egypt. The initial confrontation had ended in defeat, yet the battle for freedom had only just begun. Part 8. Signs, Marvels, and Warnings. The eastern sky bloomed with first light as Moses walked alone along the Nile's edge. Reeds whispered against each other in the gentle current, the same reeds that had previously sheltered him as an infant in a pitch-coated vessel. The divine had spoken to him again in the night, renewing the guarantee. "I will bring you out from beneath the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their captivity, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments." The water lapped at the shoreline, rhythmic and ancient. Moses clutched the rod in his hand, the same unassuming piece of wood that had transformed to serpent and back. "I will harden Pharaoh's spirit," the divine had warned, "and multiply my signs and marvels in Egypt's territory." The path ahead would be neither swift nor easy, yet the outcome was certain as the rising sun. Aaron joined him as the morning brightened, his face etched with the same determination that presently filled Moses' spirit. Together they waited as the royal barge appeared on the broad waterway, its purple sails billowing in the morning breeze. Pharaoh had arrived to perform his devotions to Hapi, the Nile deity, unaware that heaven and earth's true divine awaited him on the shore. As Pharaoh stepped onto the riverbank, attended by priests in white linen, Moses and Aaron approached with quiet confidence. "The Lord, the Hebrews' divine, has sent me to you," Moses declared through Aaron's voice, stating, "Release my people that they may serve me in the wilderness. Yet indeed, until presently, you would not hear." Pharaoh's face darkened with disdain. Yet before he could speak, Moses lifted the rod above the sacred waters of the Nile. "By this you shall understand that I am the Lord," he continued, with Aaron speaking his words. Moses struck the water with the rod. Before the astonished vision of Pharaoh and his priests, the flowing current transformed, its clear depths turning thick and crimson like freshly spilled blood. The transformation spread outward from the contact point, a stain flowing both upstream and down. Fish rose to the surface, gasping and dying in the oxygen-depleted water. Birds that had been diving for their morning sustenance took flight in confusion. The priests of Hapi stepped back in horror, their white garments presently spattered with red droplets. Pharaoh's initial shock gave way to calculated composure. He summoned his own magicians who huddled together with their secret crafts and incantations. Using vessels of water drawn before the transformation, they likewise produced blood through their enigmatic techniques. "Observe," Pharaoh scoffed. "Your divine is not unique in power." Still, even as he spoke, death's stench rose from the waterway that was Egypt's lifeblood. For 7 days, the Nile remained blood. Egyptians dug frantically along the riverbanks, pursuing groundwater unaffected by the curse. The poor suffered most, unable to purchase water from distant wells. Still, Pharaoh's spirit remained hard, unmoved by the suffering of his own people or the power displayed before him. When the waterway cleared at last, Moses and Aaron returned to Pharaoh with the identical demand, "Release my people." Again they were met with refusal. Aaron stretched his hand with the rod over Egypt's waters, waterways, canals, ponds, and reservoirs. From the transformed waters emerged countless frogs, an army of amphibians covering the territory in a living, croaking carpet. They entered dwellings and bedchambers, leaped into ovens and kneading bowls. The sacred animals of the goddess Heket, normally welcomed in carefully controlled numbers, transformed into an overwhelming affliction. Zero corner of Egypt was spared their invasion. Pharaoh's magicians, with their secret crafts, managed to produce additional frogs, a pointless demonstration that only worsened the affliction. For the first time, Pharaoh's resolve wavered. Summoning Moses and Aaron, he guaranteed, "Entreat the Lord that he may remove the frogs from me and from my people, and I will release the people that they may sacrifice to the Lord." Moses responded with dignified courtesy, "Accept the honor of stating when I shall intercede for you, for your servants, and for your people to destroy the frogs." "Tomorrow," Pharaoh replied, perhaps hoping the affliction would end naturally before then. Moses nodded. "Let it be according to your word, that you may understand there is 0 like the Lord our divine." The next day, at Moses' prayer, the frogs died where they were, in dwellings, courtyards, and fields. Egyptians gathered them in massive, stinking heaps that poisoned the atmosphere with decay. Still, when Pharaoh observed relief had arrived, his spirit hardened once more. The guarantee to release the Hebrews evaporated like morning mist beneath the hot Egyptian sun. Moses and Aaron departed the palace with heavy spirits, yet unwavering resolve. The pattern was established. Divine demand, miraculous sign, temporary concession, and renewed defiance. Yet with each cycle, the signs would intensify, and Egypt would learn that the captives' divine commanded powers beyond their imagining. The rod that had transformed water and summoned frogs would soon strike Egypt's dust itself, bringing new marvels and new warnings to a monarch whose spirit grew harder with each divine challenge to his sovereignty. Part 9. Waters run crimson, and frogs occupy the territory. The Nile flowed clear again beneath the Egyptian sun, its life-giving waters restored after 7 days of blood. In villages and settlements along its banks, individuals spoke in hushed tones about the Hebrew deity who had struck at Hapi, the very deity of their sacred waterway. Priests performed elaborate purification rituals, burning incense and offering sacrifices to restore harmony with the offended deities of Egypt. Palace scribes recorded the strange events in careful hieroglyphics, documenting a challenge to cosmic order unlike any in living memory. Moses walked through the marketplace of Ramesses, observing the aftermath of the initial affliction. Women balanced water jars on their heads, offspring splashed at the riverbank, fishermen cast their nets, existence returning to normal rhythms. Still, nothing was truly normal. Egyptians eyed him with new wariness, stepping aside as he passed. Some spat on the ground behind him, others made protective gestures against evil. A few servants who had witnessed the confrontation at the riverside bowed their heads slightly, acknowledging power they did not comprehend, yet had learned to respect. Night descended across the delta, stars reflecting in the countless waterways that made Egypt the most abundant territory in the known realm. In his modest dwelling, Moses knelt in prayer, communing with the divine whose voice had transformed his existence at the flame-filled shrub. "They will not listen," he whispered into the darkness. Pharaoh's spirit remains hard as stone. The divine response arrived not in audible words, yet in profound certainty, filling his spirit. This was merely the beginning. Egypt would learn that Abraham's divine commanded not just one waterway, yet all creation. Dawn discovered Moses and Aaron again, approaching Pharaoh's palace, their shadows stretching long across the courtyard stones. Court officials exchanged nervous glances as the Hebrew kinsmen were announced. Pharaoh, seated upon his throne beneath a canopy of blue and gold, received them with thinly veiled contempt. "What presently?" he demanded, fingers drumming impatiently on the armrest of his ornate chair. Aaron, speaking Moses' words, delivered the unchanging message. "Thus declares the Lord, the Hebrews divine. Release my people that they may serve me." The familiar demand hung in the atmosphere between them, met with the familiar refusal in Pharaoh's frigid stare. 0 further words were necessary. The pattern had been established. Aaron extended the rod over Egypt's waters, not just the Nile this time, yet every canal, pond, and reservoir throughout the territory. The water's surface commenced to bulge and ripple as if boiling, though it remained cool to the touch. Then they appeared, countless frogs surging from the depths, their sleek green bodies covering the water in living blankets before spreading across the territory in ever-widening circles. They leaped through open openings, crowded doorways, filled courtyards and gardens. The sacred animals of Heket, the frog-headed goddess of fertility and resurrection, transformed into an unstoppable army, invading every corner of Egyptian existence. Offspring initially laughed, chasing the creatures through the streets in spontaneous games. By nightfall, the laughter had ceased. Frogs entered bedchambers, nestled in clothing chests, plopped into cooking pots, and leaped from beneath pillows. Their constant croaking created a deafening chorus that allowed zero rest. Even the palace was not spared. Royal chambers transformed as overrun as the humblest farmer's dwelling. Pharaoh summoned his court magicians, who gathered with their scrolls and wands to counter this new assault. Through their secret crafts, perhaps sleight of hand, perhaps darker powers, they likewise produced frogs. Still, this demonstration only worsened an already unbearable situation, adding to the affliction rather than alleviating it. The chief magician bowed apologetically before his monarch, admitting they could create frogs yet not remove them. For the first time, Pharaoh's resolution wavered. Surrounded by croaking creatures desecrating even his sacred person, he called for Moses and Aaron. Their arrival in the throne room was delayed, as palace servants cleared a path through the hopping masses. Pharaoh's voice betrayed his desperation. "Entreat the Lord, that he may remove the frogs from me and from my people, and I will release the people that they may sacrifice to the Lord." Moses responded with unexpected courtesy. "Accept the honor of stating when I shall intercede for you, for your servants and for your people, to destroy the frogs from you and your dwellings, that they may remain in the waterway only." It was a deliberate offer. Allowing Pharaoh to set the time would demonstrate that the affliction's end arrived by divine command, not by natural cycle or coincidence. "Tomorrow," Pharaoh replied, perhaps hoping the frogs would disappear on their own before then. Moses nodded solemnly. "Let it be according to your word, that you may understand there is 0 like the Lord our divine." He departed, leaving Pharaoh to another night shared with countless unwelcome amphibian visitors. Moses spent the evening in prayer beneath the open sky, Abraham's stars wheeling overhead. When morning arrived, he lifted his hands toward heaven in intercession for the territory that had previously been his dwelling and presently held his people captive. Across Egypt, frogs ceased their endless croaking. They died where they were, in dwellings, courtyards, fields, and sacred structures. Egyptians gathered them in great heaps that soon putrefied beneath the hot sun, adding death's stench to invasion's aftermath. Pharaoh ventured outside his palace, stepping carefully around servants scraping deceased frogs from the royal gardens. His relief at observing the affliction ended was short-lived when reports arrived from frontier regions. The territory of Goshen, where the Hebrews dwelled, had been enigmatically spared the frog invasion's worst. The implication was unmistakable. This was targeted divine action, not random natural disaster. Still, as the final frog corpses were cleared away and the atmosphere gradually freshened, Pharaoh's momentary humility dissolved. Court advisors reminded him of Egypt's dignity, of the economic importance of Hebrew captive labor, of the dangerous precedent that yielding to their demands would establish. Hardening his spirit against his own guarantee, Pharaoh sent word to the supervisors. Production portions would remain unchanged. The Hebrews would not be permitted their wilderness pilgrimage. When Moses received this news, he stood silent for a long moment, gazing toward the palace gleaming in the distance. The pattern was clearer presently. Demand, refusal, affliction, temporary concession, then renewed defiance once relief arrived. Egypt had still to learn the complete extent of divine power, and Pharaoh had still to comprehend the cost of opposing heaven and earth's creator. The divine who had transformed water to blood and summoned a frog army was only beginning to demonstrate his might. Part 10. Lice, Flies, and Disease. Morning mist hung low over Egypt's fields as laborers prepared for another day of toil. Farmers testing the soil with their fingers discovered it still moist from the last flood, rich with promise for the coming harvest. Egyptian existence had always moved to the Nile's rhythm, planting, growing, harvesting, waiting for the next inundation to renew the territory's fertility. Even after blood had flowed in their sacred waterway and frogs had invaded their dwellings, the people clung to these ancient patterns, pursuing normalcy amid disruption. The sun rose higher, burning away the mist to reveal fields where Hebrew captives already bent beneath the supervisor's gaze. Their suffering had only intensified since Moses' initial audience with Pharaoh. Each affliction brought temporary hope, followed by deeper disappointment as Pharaoh's spirit hardened once more. Some presently avoided Moses when he walked through Goshen, blaming him for their increased burdens. Others watched him with desperate hope, clinging to the guarantee of a deity who remembered his covenant after 4 centuries of silence. Moses and Aaron approached Pharaoh, not in his palace this time, yet in the royal gardens, where he pursued mourning solitude. 0 formal announcement preceded them. They simply appeared on the path before him, causing his protectors to reach for their weapons. Pharaoh waved them back with imperious disdain. "What presently, Hebrew? Have you not brought enough misery to Egypt?" Aaron extended the rod at Moses' silent command, yet this time he struck neither water nor atmosphere. Instead, he struck the very ground at Pharaoh's feet. "Thus declares the Lord," Aaron proclaimed, "Release my people that they may serve me." Egypt's dust, stirred by the rod, rose in clouds that hung suspended longer than natural physics should allow. As Pharaoh watched with narrowing vision, the dust transformed, each particle becoming minute existence. Lice, or perhaps gnats, as some translations suggest, swarmed forth from the enchanted dust. Unlike the frogs that had taken hours to spread across the territory, this affliction manifested instantly everywhere. The tiny insects covered humans and animals alike, crawling through hair, burrowing into clothing, finding their path beneath the finest royal linens and the coarsest captive garments. 0 amount of bathing or ointment provided relief from their constant irritation. Pharaoh, scratching despite his dignity, summoned his magicians. They arrived reluctantly, their own bodies hosting unwelcome parasites. Their scrolls and instruments appeared powerless against this new affliction. After multiple failed attempts to replicate the marvel, the chief magician bowed his head in unprecedented acknowledgement. "This is the divine's finger." For the first time, Egypt's occult experts recognized power beyond their comprehension or replication. Still, Pharaoh's spirit remained hard. Perhaps he could not bear the humiliation of yielding to captive demands, or perhaps, as Scripture suggests, divine intention was at work in his stubborn refusal. Whatever the cause, the Hebrew petition received the identical denial. Even as courtiers scratched themselves raw and livestock stamped in discomfort throughout the territory, the lice affliction continued without abatement, transforming into the new normal of Egyptian existence. Then, without warning, Moses appeared at Pharaoh's morning ritual by the waterway. "Thus declares the Lord," he declared through Aaron's voice, "Release my people that they may serve me. Or else, if you will not release my people, observe, I will send swarms of flies on you and your servants, on your people, and into your dwellings." This time, Moses added a new element to the divine message. "And in that day, I will set apart the territory of Goshen in which my people dwell, that 0 swarms of flies shall be there, in order that you may understand that I am the Lord in the midst of the territory." This distinction would demonstrate beyond question that these were not natural disasters, yet targeted divine judgments. Pharaoh turned away without response, his attendants clearing a path through prostrating courtiers. The following day, just as had been promised, Egypt found itself invaded by countless flies. These weren't your typical household insects, but rather biting, hostile creatures that rendered everyday existence unbearable. Vendors abandoned their market stalls, fleeing from the relentless stinging swarms. Parents kept their children confined inside. Sacred religious rituals were left incomplete as temple priests discovered their holy chambers contaminated by these impure flying pests. What proved most extraordinary was the distinct boundary that seemed to exist within the atmosphere itself. The region of Gan, home to the Israelites, experienced no contact whatsoever with this airborne affliction. Egyptian citizens living close to the border observed this supernatural division with their very own eyes. Thick masses of flies that simply refused to penetrate an unseen barrier into the territory where the Hebrews resided. This discriminating judgment made it progressively harder to remain in denial. Clearly, something or someone was specifically singling out Egypt for punishment while simultaneously shielding Israel. The invasive fly swarms paralyzed Egyptian society completely, making it impossible to engage in commerce, fulfill religious obligations, or even consume food without relentless interference. Eventually, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron once more. His proposal arrived wrapped in begrudging resistance. Perform your sacrifices to your deity here within our borders. This was a calculated compromise designed to preserve his authority, permitting worship while denying genuine liberation. Moses courteously, yet resolutely declined this proposal. That would be inappropriate, for what we would sacrifice to the Lord our God is considered an abomination by Egyptians. Should we offer up what the people of Egypt regard as sacred? Would they not attack us with stones? His alternative demand stayed consistent. A 3-day expedition into the desert, nothing shorter and nothing longer. Confronted by a paralyzed nation, Pharaoh conceded slightly more ground. I will permit you to depart so you may offer sacrifices to the Lord your God out in the wilderness. Just be certain you don't travel too far from here. Pray for me. This represented advancement, though the qualification about not going too far away exposed his desire to keep them within reach and under his control. Moses consented to intercede through prayer, but he included a cautionary statement. Pharaoh must not continue to act with deception by refusing to release the people for worship to the Lord. He'd absorbed the lesson from the violated commitment following the frog infestation. Divine authority would eliminate the flies, yet divine omniscience anticipated human treachery. The next morning, the swarms disappeared just as thoroughly as they'd materialized. Not even a single fly lingered to disturb Egypt. Commerce resumed, young ones ventured back outside, and religious officials returned to their ceremonies with intensified devotion to deities that had proven powerless to defend them. Accounts verified the miracle's thoroughness. Throughout the entire kingdom, from the Delta region to the southern territories, Egypt could breathe without harassment again. However, exactly as Moses had feared, and divine foreknowledge had predicted, Pharaoh's resolve hardened yet again. The instant relief arrived. Renewed stubbornness followed. The border sentries stayed posted at their stations. The Hebrew laborers received orders to return to their work. The fleeting possibility of freedom vanished like dew in the morning under Egypt's scorching sun. Moses received this update with grave acknowledgement rather than shock. The cycle persisted. Yet each repetition disclosed more of God's might and intention to both the Egyptians and the Israelites. The subsequent divine communication arrived with intensifying ramifications. Approach Pharaoh and declare to him, "The Lord God of the Hebrews commands this: release my people so they may worship me." Aaron presented the recognizable ultimatum, though accompanied by a fresh admonition. Should you decline to release them and persist in holding them captive, take notice. The hand of the Lord will strike your livestock throughout the fields, affecting the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the cattle, and the sheep with extremely severe disease. The next sunrise revealed Egypt facing catastrophe. Animals lay deceased or perishing throughout the territory. Horses crucial for warfare, strength, cattle indispensable for farming, sheep and goats required for nourishment and religious offerings. Egypt's economic infrastructure faced threats from mysterious illness that attacked with supernatural precision. Pharaoh dispatched emissaries to Gan and obtained verification of yet another miraculous occurrence. Not a single creature belonging to the Hebrews had suffered any harm. This affliction targeted Egypt's prosperity, religious customs requiring animal offerings, and military strength dependent upon horses. Still, Despite mounting proof and his own counselors becoming increasingly frightened, Pharaoh's resolve stayed hardened. The financial devastation, while substantial, hadn't yet reached completion. As dead animals were hauled away from pastures and barns across Egypt, the monarch of Earth's mightiest empire persisted on his doomed trajectory of resistance against the God of enslaved people. Every plague stripped away another protective layer of Egyptian stability and independence. Each divine demonstration revealed with greater clarity how powerless Egypt's collection of gods proved against the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The confrontation between Pharaoh and Moses was transforming into a visible illustration of a deeper reality. No worldly authority could oppose heaven's will when the appointed moment for deliverance had arrived. Part 11. Painful boils and destructive hailstorms. Morning sunlight created elongated shadows over the desert sands as Moses and Aaron positioned themselves before Pharaoh yet again. 6 times previously they'd appeared bearing warnings. 6 times they'd observed God's authority manifested. And 6 times they'd watched Pharaoh's heart harden like clay baked in desert temperatures. The atmosphere felt thick with expectation, since the sequence had been established. Still, nobody could anticipate what shape the coming judgment would assume. Collect handfuls of ash from a kiln, God had directed Moses during the pre-dawn hours, and cast it skyward in Pharaoh's presence. These instructions lingered in Moses' thoughts as he stood upright, his weathered palms now containing fine soot. With a single quick movement, he flung the dark particles upward where they appeared to hover momentarily before scattering on the breeze like minuscule seeds of condemnation. As these particles drifted over the territory, a horrifying transformation commenced. Initially among the royal officials, then expanding across every avenue and pathway throughout Egypt, inflamed red lesions erupted on flesh. The boils appeared on humans and animals alike, agonizing blisters that ruptured and wept. Even Pharaoh's sorcerers, those who'd previously replicated God's miracles, now found themselves unable to appear before Moses due to the boils covering their frames from scalp to soul. They withdrew in torment, their occult abilities worthless against the Hebrew God's authority. Pharaoh, despite suffering personally, declined to yield. He remained rigid on his throne, teeth grinding against the discomfort surging through his frame. His gaze narrowed with arrogance and inflexible resistance, tracking Moses as the prophet prepared to exit the palace. "Your God inflicts this to break me," Pharaoh shouted after him. "Yet I refuse to be conquered by these afflictions." Days elapsed, and the boils gradually mended, leaving marks on Egyptian flesh, though no transformation in their ruler's heart. When Moses returned to face Pharaoh, his declaration carried fresh urgency. "The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, proclaims this: Release my people for worship. This occasion I will dispatch all my afflictions upon your heart, and upon your officials and your population, so you will understand there exists none comparable to me throughout the entire earth." Moses lifted his rod toward the sky as storm clouds assembled with unnatural velocity, obscuring the noon sun. The rumbling of thunder echoed over the land, intensifying until it felt like the earth's very foundations shook. Then arrived a sound Egypt had seldom experienced, the piercing crack of hail pounding the ground. However, this proved far from typical weather. The frozen chunks fell in enormous pieces, each fragment substantial enough to kill any person or creature caught exposed. And contained within the ice flickered something terrifying. Flames. Flames and ice simultaneously. A merger of contradictory elements descended upon Egypt. The hail struck with lethal accuracy, obliterating the barley and flax growing in fields, splintering tree limbs, and claiming lives of anyone who disregarded the warning to find protection. Yet Gan, where Israel's descendants lived, stayed completely unaffected. There the atmosphere remained clear and peaceful, as though the tempest acknowledged the invisible perimeter surrounding the Hebrew communities and honored it. This discriminating judgment, this divine exactness, communicated extensively about the force controlling these afflictions. For the initial time, terror appeared on Pharaoh's features. He requested Moses and Aaron urgently. "I have transgressed on this occasion," he confessed, his tone wavering. "The Lord possesses righteousness, while my people and I embody wickedness. Appeal to the Lord. Since there's been sufficient divine thunder and hail, I will permit your departure, and you need remain no longer." Moses studied him carefully, observing the brief crack in Pharaoh's defenses. "The moment I've departed the city, I will extend my hands toward the Lord. The thunder will stop, and hail will cease, demonstrating to you that the earth belongs to the Lord. However, concerning you and your officials, I understand you still lack genuine reverence for the Lord God." Keeping his commitment, Moses exited the city and stretched his hands heavenward. The thunder halted, the hail stopped, and rain ceased pouring on the ground. Yet when Pharaoh observed that precipitation and hail and thunder had concluded, he committed wrong once more and hardened his heart, along with his officials. The temporary display of remorse dissipated like morning vapor under Egyptian sunlight, and his determination against the Hebrews' God intensified again. 7 afflictions had now visited Egypt, yet Pharaoh's arrogance stayed intact. The territory displayed the marks of God's condemnation: crimson waters, devastated fields, and remnants of hail and flames. Citizens murmured in the streets, questioning their monarch's judgment, while the Hebrews waited, their expectations rising and dropping with each confrontation between Moses and the man holding them imprisoned. Part 12. Destructive locusts and oppressive darkness. The following morning, Moses and Aaron approached the palace bearing heaviness in their movements. 8 times they'd traveled this route. 8 times they'd conveyed warnings and observed destruction. The pattern had grown recognizable, yet no less agonizing for Moses, who derived no satisfaction from Egypt's suffering, regardless of the justice it embodied. "Approach Pharaoh," God had directed, "since I have hardened his heart along with his officials' hearts, enabling me to demonstrate these miracles among them, so you may recount to your descendants and their descendants how I dealt severely with the Egyptians, and what miracles I performed among them, ensuring you recognize that I am the Lord." Pharaoh's counselors, typically composed and silent beside their monarch, now voiced themselves before Moses could present his declaration. "How much longer must this individual remain a trap for us? Release these men for worship to the Lord their God. Haven't you grasped yet that Egypt faces ruin?" Their voices conveyed the exhaustion of individuals who'd observed their world disintegrate affliction by affliction, while their ruler's stubbornness persisted unmoved. Moses raised his palm, and his voice resonated throughout the throne chamber. "The Lord God of the Hebrews declares this: How long will you decline to humble yourself before me? Release my people for worship. Should you decline to release my people, understand, tomorrow I will introduce locusts into your territory. They will blanket the ground's surface, preventing anyone from seeing the earth, and they will consume what remains after the hail, and they will devour every tree growing in your fields. They will occupy your residences, and the residences of all your officials and of all Egyptians." Without awaiting Pharaoh's reaction, Moses pivoted and left. Sufficient words had been exchanged. The moment for consequences had arrived again. The eastern wind commenced that evening, subtle initially, then building in force throughout the night until it screamed across the territory, transporting with it a sound resembling rushing water. When daybreak came, the Egyptians gazed toward the horizon and observed a dark mass approaching. Not precipitation, but countless millions of locusts, their wings reflecting morning light as they fell upon the territory. The invasion descended on Egypt like a living shadow, consuming every green thing that had survived the hail. Fields that might have produced partial crops were reduced to barren soil within hours. Trees stood naked, their branches stripped bare of foliage, fruit, and tender bark. The earth vanished beneath a writhing blanket of insects, and the atmosphere filled with the noise of their relentless feeding, a noise that compelled some to block their ears in hopelessness. The locusts infiltrated everywhere, into residences, storage chambers, even the holy spaces of temples. Nothing escaped their voracious appetite. Throughout a territory dependent on farming, this affliction attacked the core of Egyptian survival. Starvation now appeared on the horizon, a ghost more frightening than any they'd experienced previously. Pharaoh requested Moses and Aaron with remarkable haste. "I have wronged the Lord your God and wronged you," he acknowledged, desperation clear in his tone. "Therefore now, pardon my transgression just this single time, and appeal to the Lord your God so he would remove from me this mortality alone." Moses departed Pharaoh's company and appealed to the Lord. In answer, God dispatched a powerful western wind that elevated the locusts and propelled them into the Red Sea. Not one single locust stayed throughout all Egyptian land. Yet again, when the urgent danger had subsided, Pharaoh's heart hardened, and he declined to release the people. This pattern of affliction, incomplete penitence, and renewed resistance had occurred 8 times now. God addressed Moses, directing him for the 9th confrontation, one requiring no warning, no rod, no motion, simply darkness. Moses extended his hand toward the sky, and a darkness fell upon Egypt unlike anything they'd encountered previously. This wasn't merely light's absence, but a darkness so dense it appeared physical, as though one could extend outward and perceive its mass. For 3 days no Egyptian could observe another, nor could anyone arise from their location. Movement became unfeasible, direction lost in the total blackness. Within this impenetrable dark, the Egyptians faced their most profound terrors. Some wept, convinced the sun deity Ra had forsaken them. Others shouted to family members, receiving no response, though they might be separated by mere inches. Time lost all significance in the perpetual night. Yet in Gan, illumination shone in the Hebrews' homes. They moved unrestricted, cared for their animals, and prepared their food by natural light, while their oppressors sat immobilized in darkness. A vivid demonstration of the separation God had established between his people and the Egyptians. When the darkness withdrew after 3 days, Pharaoh requested Moses again. "Proceed, worship the Lord," he granted. "Just let your livestock and herds stay here. Let your young ones also accompany you." This was incomplete surrender, an attempt at negotiation. Moses shook his head resolutely. "You must additionally permit us to possess sacrifices and burnt offerings enabling us to worship the Lord our God. Our livestock must also accompany us. Not a single hoof will remain here, since we must utilize them for worship to the Lord our God." Pharaoh's features darkened with fury. "Leave my presence. Guard yourself and never observe my face again. Since the day you observe my face, you will perish." Moses regarded him with composed certainty. "You have articulated correctly. I will never observe your face again." With these statements, he left, understanding that the ultimate and most horrifying affliction remained forthcoming, one that would ultimately shatter Pharaoh's determination and liberate Israel's children from captivity. Part 13. The ultimate strike, firstborn perish. The atmosphere in Gan felt distinct that evening, filled with anticipation, weighted with approaching transformation. Moses had assembled Israel's elders to present God's most comprehensive directions yet. The 10th affliction would prove unlike any preceding it, not a display of authority over nature, but an exact judgment that would traverse every household in Egypt from the palace to the humblest residence. "This month will represent for you the commencement of months," Moses informed them, his tone steady, despite the severity of what he described. "It will constitute the initial month of your year. Instruct all Israel's community that on this month's 10th day, every individual shall obtain a lamb matching their father's households, 1 lamb per household." The elders listened attentively, as Moses clarified that the lamb must be unblemished, a male, 1 year old. Each family would maintain their lamb until the month's 14th day, when they would slaughter it at dusk. Most critically, they were to obtain some blood and apply it on the 2 doorframes and the upper beam of their residences. "The blood will serve as a marker for you on the residences where you dwell," Moses continued. And when I observe the blood, I will pass over you, and no affliction will strike you for destruction when I strike Egypt's territory. That night they were to consume the lamb's flesh roasted with fire together with unleavened bread and bitter plants. You will consume it with your belt secured, your sandals on your feet, and your rod in your hand, and you will consume it hurriedly. It is the Lord's Passover. Moses' tone grew even more grave as he described what would occur. Since I will traverse Egypt's territory that night, and I will strike all firstborn in Egypt's territory, both human and animal, and on all Egypt's deities, I will administer judgments. I am the Lord. The elders left to distribute these directions with their people. Throughout Gan, families chose lambs following Moses' instruction. For 4 days, these creatures lived among them, resting in their residences, growing familiar to the children who would soon observe their offering. On the 14th day, as the sun started its fall, fathers took blades to their lambs' throats, careful to collect the blood in containers. With hyssop bunches, they spread the blood on their doorframes, designating their households for deliverance while preparing the Passover meal inside. The aroma of roasting meat pervaded Gan as families assembled around their tables attired for travel, consuming the meal with a combination of solemnity and restrained excitement. Midnight neared. In Egyptian residences and palaces, people rested unaware of what approached. In Hebrew residences, many stayed conscious, too troubled for rest despite their readiness to leave. Then, as night's deepest hour descended upon Egypt, something traveled through the territory, invisible yet unmistakable, a presence of judgment that penetrated every residence not designated with blood. The outcry commenced at the palace, where Pharaoh personally found his firstborn son without life in his bed. A father's anguished wail resonated through royal corridors, soon accompanied by comparable cries from across the city, then throughout the countryside. From the heir to the throne, to the firstborn of the imprisoned in the dungeon, to the firstborn of animals, no Egyptian household escaped. There existed a tremendous outcry in Egypt, since there existed not a residence where someone wasn't deceased. The Egyptians who'd observed water transformed to blood, endured darkness and locusts, suffered boils and hail, now confronted a loss surpassing calculation: the mortality of their firstborn children. Egypt's future, the inheritance and expectation of every family, had been extinguished in one single night. Pharaoh arose in the night and requested Moses and Aaron. His features were pale, his royal bearing destroyed by sorrow. Arise, leave from among my people, both you and Israel's people, and proceed worship the Lord, as you've stated. Obtain your flocks and your herds, as you've stated, and depart, and bless me additionally. The Egyptians compelled Israel's people to hasten and exit the territory, declaring, "We will all be deceased if you remain." Such was their terror that they provided the Israelites whatever they requested, items of silver and gold and garments, fulfilling God's assurance that the Hebrews wouldn't depart empty-handed following their generations of unpaid service. 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, departed Egypt that night, together with a mixed assembly of non-Israelites who selected to accompany them and extremely much livestock. They transported their dough before it was leavened, their kneading containers secured and their garments on their shoulders. The bread they baked was unleavened, since they were expelled from Egypt and couldn't wait, nor had they arranged any supplies for themselves. Thus concluded 430 years of residing in a territory not their own. What had commenced with Joseph's favor generations ago and fallen into harsh slavery now reached culmination in an exodus unlike any the world had observed. An entire population departing bondage behind, directed by pillars of cloud and fire toward a promise initially given to their forefather Abraham. As they traveled from Ramesses to Succoth, Moses addressed the people. "Remember this day when you departed from Egypt out of slavery's house, since by a powerful hand the Lord brought you out from this location. When the Lord brings you into the territory that he promised to your fathers, you will maintain this observance in this month." The Passover would transform into their eternal memorial. a night to be remembered across all generations, when mortality passed over their residences and freedom was ultimately granted to a population who'd nearly forgotten what it signified to be liberated. Part 14. The Magnificent Exodus. The initial dawn light disclosed an remarkable sight. A sea of humanity extending across the landscape, moving deliberately yet purposefully away from the sole home many of them had experienced. The Israelites, numbering beyond 600,000 men besides women and children, had left from Ramesses and were presently camped at Sukkoth on the desert's boundary. Following generations of captivity, the magnificent exodus had commenced. Many walked in amazed silence, the actuality of their liberation not yet completely understood. Some cried openly, joy's tears mixed with anxiety of the unknown lying ahead. Others chanted praise to the God who had rescued them with miracles and wonders. The elderly were transported on carts or assisted by younger family members, while children raced enthusiastically between the slow-advancing groups, experiencing for the initial time the feeling of open territory without an Egyptian supervisor observing. Their belongings were limited but valuable: wrapped clothing, cooking containers, tools of different crafts, and the jewelry and treasures provided to them by the Egyptians in their urgency to observe the Israelites leave. Herds of livestock traveled alongside the population, generating a dust cloud that could be observed from considerable distances. The unleavened bread, rapidly prepared during their final night in Egypt, would be their nourishment until fresh provisions could be obtained. Moses traveled among the population, encouraging them, responding to questions, and creating order among the enormous gathering. Though he'd spent decades in Midian's quiet isolation as a shepherd, he now directed a considerably larger and more intricate flock. Beside him walked Aaron, whose voice had articulated God's words before Pharaoh and the tribal elders who assisted maintain structure within their family groups. God doesn't direct us by the Philistines' land route, although that was closer, Moses clarified to the tribal leaders as they discussed their path. Since God stated, "Lest the population reconsider," when they observe war and return to Egypt. Instead, we travel by the desert route toward the Red Sea. As the population settled into their initial night of encampment at Sukkoth, an extraordinary sign materialized. A cloud pillar ascending into the atmosphere, positioned at their camp's boundary. As darkness descended, the cloud transformed, becoming a fire pillar that illuminated the night. Whispers of wonder spread through the encampment as the population recognized this visible manifestation of God's presence and protection. The Lord will proceed before us by day in a cloud pillar to direct us along the route, and by night in a fire pillar to provide us light, Moses informed them. He will not leave from before us. Many discovered comfort in this perpetual reminder that they weren't alone in their expedition, that the identical God who had brought afflictions upon Egypt now directed them toward the promised territory. From Sukkoth they traveled to Etham at the desert's boundary. The landscape grew progressively harsh, with vegetation thinning and Egypt's fertile landscape's comfort disappearing behind them. Yet the pillar persisted before them, establishing their speed and direction. When it traveled, they dismantled camp and followed. When it stayed motionless, they rested and waited. At Etham, the Lord addressed Moses, "Instruct Israel's people to reverse and camp before Pihahiroth, between Migdal and the sea, before Balon. You will camp facing it by the sea." This direction appeared strange, an intentional backtracking toward Egypt rather than advancing into the desert. However, Moses trusted God's strategy without question. Pharaoh will state of Israel's people, "They are wandering in the territory. The desert has trapped them," God continued, "and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. Yet I will obtain glory over Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will recognize that I am the Lord." The population followed the pillar to this fresh encampment by the sea, though some complained about the evident confusion in their expedition. They'd barely settled when observers spotted a dust cloud on the horizon approaching from Egypt's direction. As the dust cloud advanced closer, the gleam of sunlight on metal disclosed the reality. Pharaoh's military was in pursuit, Terror spread through the camp like wildfire. Families collected their children close as the distant rumble of chariot wheels intensified. Egyptian military strength was legendary, featuring the most advanced chariot force in the recognized world. Pharaoh had indeed reconsidered. His sorrow over his firstborn now transformed into fury at the loss of his slave workforce. Was it due to no graves in Egypt that you've removed us away to perish in the desert? Some shouted to Moses. What have you performed to us in removing us from Egypt? Isn't this what we stated to you in Egypt? Abandon us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians, since it would have been superior for us to serve the Egyptians than perish in the desert. Moses gazed upon the population with compassion, comprehending their terror, yet unwavering in his faith. He elevated his voice so all could perceive. Don't fear. Remain firm and observe the Lord's salvation, which he will accomplish for you today. Since the Egyptians whom you observe today, you will never observe again. The Lord will battle for you, and you have only to remain silent. As the Egyptian military drew closer, the cloud pillar traveled, not forward, but behind Israel's camp, positioning itself between the Hebrews and their pursuers. On the Egyptian side, the pillar projected darkness. On the Israelite side, it provided light. Throughout that tense night, this supernatural barrier prevented the Egyptians from approaching the Israelite encampment. The population waited on the Red Sea shore, caught between the advancing military and the impassable waters. Their expedition had barely commenced, yet already they confronted an impossible situation. What would morning deliver? Would their freedom prove to be tragically temporary? Or would the God who had brought 10 afflictions upon Egypt accomplish yet another wonder on their behalf? With these questions weighing substantially on their hearts, the Israelites observed and waited through the night, the fire pillar their sole comfort, as the Egyptian camp's sounds resonated across the darkened landscape. Part 15. Traversing the Red Sea. Night gradually yielded to dawn, coloring the eastern atmosphere with strokes of rose and gold. The Israelites, having spent troubled hours listening to the distant noises of the Egyptian camp, now confronted the complete light of day and the actuality of their situation. Before them extended the Red Sea's enormous waters. Behind them, Pharaoh's military prepared for combat, and on every side rose desert too severe for escape. They stood at impossibility's boundary. Moses stood at the waterline, his rod extended toward the waters, as the Lord had directed him. The ascending sun captured his outline, a solitary figure whose elevated arms formed a connection between sky and ground. The initial breath of wind contacted his features, mild at first, then intensifying moment by moment. This was no typical desert breeze, but a forceful east wind dispatched by God himself. The wind intensified to gale strength, screaming across the waters with supernatural power. The sea commenced to churn, then to divide, not as water splashing apart, but as solid barriers rising on either hand. A pathway materialized on the ocean floor, the ground drying under the intense wind until it became traversable. Where moments previously there had been only an impassable obstacle, now extended a road through the water's midst. Forward, Moses shouted to the population, his tone barely perceptible above the wind. God has created a route where there was no route. The Israelite tribes traveled toward this miraculous passage with a combination of terror and wonder. Some rushed ahead enthusiastically, while others approached the sea route with uncertain steps, glancing anxiously at the ascending water barriers on either side. Children extended out inquisitive hands to contact these liquid ramparts, pulling back in amazement as they perceived the spray against their fingertips. Family by family, tribe by tribe, the Israelites fell onto the ocean floor. The water barriers stood solid on their right hand and on their left, generating a corridor wide enough for numerous families to walk side by side. The ground beneath their feet, which should have been mud and sand, had been dried by the wind into a traversable pathway. What should have been dark depths was now illuminated by the peculiar filtered light that penetrated the water barriers. Ocean creatures could be observed suspended in the water, Fish large and small held motionless in their travel's midst, their silver scales capturing the light like innumerable tiny reflectors. Shells and coral that had rested on the ocean floor for centuries now crunched under the passing Hebrew's feet. Children indicated in amazement at the underwater realm suddenly disclosed around them, momentarily forgetting the danger that pursued them. Behind the Israelites, the cloud pillar sustained its position, persisting to separate them from the Egyptian forces. However, as the final Hebrew families entered the sea passage, the pillar commenced to travel, permitting the Egyptians to ultimately observe their quarry escaping through the divided waters. Pharaoh, propelled by fury and the humiliation of being compelled to release his slaves, commanded his chariot forces forward. "Pursue them!" he shouted, his tone filled with rage. "They will not escape." 600 selected chariots, and all Egypt's other chariots with officers over all of them, pursued the Israelites into the sea pathway. The Egyptian charioteers advanced forward confidently at first, their wheels turning easily on the dried ocean floor. The narrow passage compelled them to form a column rather than their favored combat formation. Yet they advanced, certain of their capacity to overtake the slower traveling Israelites. The thunder of horses' hooves and rumble of chariot wheels resonated between the water barriers as they closed the distance. The Israelites perceived the approaching military and quickened their speed, parents transporting smaller children, the young assisting the elderly. Panic spread through their ranks at the thought of being captured in this narrow corridor with nowhere to escape. The sea route appeared endless, extending before them with the distant shore still far away. Then, in the morning observation, the Lord gazed down on the Egyptian forces through the fire and cloud pillar, and threw the Egyptian forces into disorder. The chariot wheels commenced to sink into suddenly softening ground, then to detach entirely, causing the vehicles to lurch and overturn. "Let us escape from before Israel," the Egyptians shouted, "since the Lord battles for them against the Egyptians." By now, the initial Israelites had reached the far shore, ascending up from the ocean floor to solid ground once more. They reversed back to observe the scene behind them, their population still traversing, the Egyptian military in chaos within the sea route, and Moses standing at the water's boundary with his rod extended. When the final Israelite had reached safety, the Lord stated to Moses, "Extend your hand over the sea, so the water may return upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen." Moses obeyed, extending his rod toward the waters once more. The wind halted as abruptly as it had commenced, and the water barriers released from their divine suspension collapsed back together with thunderous force. The Egyptian military, chariots, horsemen, and all who had followed them into the sea was engulfed in the returning waters. Not one of them persisted. Israel stood on the shore in amazed silence, observing as the proof of their pursuers, broken chariot fragments, weapons, and soldiers' bodies washed up on the shore. The sea that had divided for their deliverance had transformed into the instrument of their enemies' obliteration. The identical authority that had defended them had also eliminated the threat of re-enslavement or massacre. Israel observed the tremendous authority that the Lord utilized against the Egyptians, and the actuality of their rescue sank deep into their hearts. The God who had dispatched afflictions to secure their freedom had now created a route through the impassable sea and defeated the mightiest military in the recognized world on their behalf. Moses reversed to the population, elevating his voice in a song of victory that they would teach their children and their children's children. "I will chant to the Lord, since he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will elevate him." Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, obtained a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her with tambourines and dancing. Miriam chanted to them, "Chant to the Lord, since he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea." As the song and dance of celebration persisted, the actuality settled upon them. They were genuinely liberated at last. The Red Sea's waters now stood between them and Egypt, between slavery and liberty. The expedition ahead stayed long and unknown. Yet on this shore this day, they had observed salvation with their very own eyes. The exodus was complete. The desert expedition now commenced in earnest. Part 16. Undrinkable water and heaven's bread. The Red Sea's waters settled behind them, consuming Egypt's strength. Israel's population stood upon the eastern shore, their sandals still moist with salt water, their hearts pounding with their salvation's echo. They had observed the unfeasible, a route through the depths, water barriers standing solid against nature's laws, and then the thunderous collapse as Pharaoh's military vanished beneath the waves. As their rescue's actuality washed over them, songs arose from their lips. Miriam, Moses' sister, obtained her tambourine and directed the women in dance, their voices transporting across the desert. However, freedom discloses itself gradually, unfolding like a desert flower. 3 days elapsed as they traveled through Shur's desert, and no water blessed their dried lips. Thirst's weight hung substantial upon them, children crying out, animals growing weak. When they ultimately found water at Marah, expectations surged through the camp only to crash against bitter disappointment. The water was undrinkable, bitter as tears. Their freedom's sweetness commenced to sour. "What will we drink?" they shouted to Moses, their voices ragged with thirst. The question conveyed deeper significance. What kind of freedom is this that directs to mortality in the desert? Had they escaped Pharaoh only to confront a slower end? Moses reversed to the Lord, his own throat tight with thirst and concern. The Lord revealed him a piece of wood, nothing extraordinary to observe. When Moses cast it into the bitter waters, a transformation happened. Bitterness transformed to sweetness, and the population drank deeply. Here at Marah, God disclosed more than a miracle. He presented a covenant. Should you listen carefully to the Lord your God's voice and perform what is right in his sight, should you pay attention to his commands and maintain all his decrees, I will not bring on you any diseases I brought on the Egyptians, since I am the Lord who heals you. The expedition persisted to Elim, where 12 water springs flowed beside 70 palm trees, a location of abundance following scarcity, shade following exposure, rest following trial. Yet desert expeditions seldom pause long in such pleasant locations. As the population traveled into the Sin Desert between Elim and Sea, hunger commenced to shadow their steps. A month and a half had elapsed since their departure from Egypt. The food they had transported was exhausted, and barren territory provided little sustenance. Memory commenced its mild distortion. "If only we had perished by the Lord's hand in Egypt," they murmured. "There we sat around meat pots and consumed all the food we desired. Yet you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to mortality." Such is freedom's nature. It demands more of us than slavery ever did. Captivity required only submission. Liberty demands trust, patience, and responsibility. The desert strips away illusions, disclosing what genuinely resides in human hearts. God addressed Moses, his voice mild with comprehension. "I will rain down bread from heaven for you." In the evening stillness, quail blanketed the camp, providing the population meat, and in the morning, a fine frost-like substance materialized on the desert floor. Manna, heaven's bread, mysterious as its name. What is it? Small as coriander seed, white as frost, tasting of honey. The manna materialized each morning with the dew. The population received instruction to collect only what they required for the day, an OMR for each individual. Those who collected much had nothing remaining over, and those who collected little had enough. When some attempted to store it overnight, it bred worms and grew rotten, teaching them dependence on daily provision. Yet on the 6th day, they collected twice as much, since the 7th day was to be a Sabbath of rest. On this day alone, the extra portion stayed fresh. For 40 years, this bread would sustain them. A generation living on daily miracles, never planting, never harvesting, yet never hungry. Each morning brought the identical question, do we trust for today? Each morning brought the identical answer, here is enough. At Rephidim, thirst once more tested the population's faith. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock perish of thirst? They demanded of Moses. Their complaint conveyed a deeper accusation. Is the Lord among us or not? Moses shouted out to the Lord, what am I to perform with these people? They are almost ready to attack me with stones. The Lord directed Moses to the rock at Horeb, directing him to strike it with the rod that had transformed the Nile to blood. As Moses obeyed, water gushed forth from solid stone, life from the seemingly lifeless. They named the location Massa and Meribah, signifying testing and quarreling, a monument to doubt and divine patience. In this severe landscape, another test awaited, not of hunger or thirst, yet of outside danger. The Amalekites, desert warriors and Esau's descendants, attacked the vulnerable Israelites. Moses commanded Joshua, a young individual of courage, to choose men for combat, while he personally ascended a nearby hill with God's rod held high. As long as Moses maintained his hands elevated, Israel prevailed. When his strength failed and his hands lowered, the Amalekites obtained advantage. Aaron and Hur positioned Moses on a stone and sustained his hands, one on each side, until sunset brought victory to Israel. In this initial combat of their freedom, they learned another desert lesson. Their strength arrived not from weapons or warriors, yet from God's authority channeled through human faithfulness, even when that faithfulness required community support. Between the bitter waters and heaven's bread, between thirst slaked from rocks and battlefield victories, the population commenced to learn freedom's grammar. Each challenge disclosed both their weakness and God's provision. Each complaint met not with punishment, yet with grace. The desert was proving to be not just a geographical territory between Egypt and Canaan, yet a spiritual territory where slaves could gradually learn to become a nation, where terror could gradually yield to faith. Part 17. Covenant at Mount C. In the 3rd month following leaving Egypt, as spring yielded to early summer, the Israelites reached C's desert. The mountain arose before them, not the tallest peak, not the most impressive to observe, yet destined to transform into the most significant mountain in their history. Here at Si's foot, they established camp, their tents expanding across the plain like white flowers blooming in the desert. Moses ascended the mountain, ascending into mist and mystery. There God summoned to him, presenting words that would define this population permanently. You yourselves have observed what I performed to Egypt, and how I transported you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now, should you obey me completely, and maintain my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Moses returned to the population, assembling the elders to distribute these words of promise and purpose. Their response arrived unified and immediate. We will perform everything the Lord has stated. They had been slaves without choice. Now they selected freely to bind themselves to God's covenant. Moses brought their answer back to the Lord, who responded with directions. Proceed to the population and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their garments and be ready by the 3rd day, since on that day the Lord will descend on Mount Si in the sight of all the population. Boundaries were established around the mountain. Anyone who contacted it would perish. The population washed themselves and their garments, preparing as a bride for her wedding day. On the 3rd day's morning, thunder rolled across the atmosphere, and lightning flashed among dark clouds that shrouded the mountain. A trumpet blast, not created by human lips, intensified louder and louder until it penetrated the very bones of those who perceived. The mountain trembled under divine presence's weight, smoke ascending from it like a living thing's breath. Moses directed the trembling population out of the camp to the mountain's foot. There they stood, a nation barely born, confronting the God who had selected them. God summoned Moses to ascend, and in cloud and fire's midst, smoke and lightning, divine words flowed into human ears. Initially arrived the 10 words, what we term the 10 Commandments, the fundamental principles of their relationship with God and with each other. Simple, yet profound, they commenced with relationship. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of slavery's territory. Before any command arrived, this reminder, law flows from love, obligation from salvation. Only after establishing who he was and what he had performed did God describe how they should live. No other deities, no idols, no misuse of the divine name. Remember the Sabbath, honor parents, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't covet what belongs to others. In these 10 principles lay the foundation for a society unlike any the world had recognized. One constructed not on authority, yet on justice, not on exploitation, yet on dignity, not on terror, yet on reverence. The population observed the thunder and lightning, perceived the trumpet, and observed the mountain in smoke. Terror overwhelmed them, and they trembled, staying at a distance. Address us yourself, and we will listen, they stated to Moses. Yet don't have God address us, or we will perish. Moses reassured them. Don't be afraid. God has arrived to test you, so the terror of God will be with you to maintain you from sinning. Yet the population stayed at a distance, while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. There followed a more comprehensive covenant code, laws for everyday life, for handling servants and settling disputes, for compensating injuries and defending the vulnerable, laws about hospitality to strangers, care for widows and orphans, honest dealings in business, laws that recognized human frailty yet called for a higher standard, laws that would transform a slave population into a holy nation. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses stayed on the mountain receiving instruction. The pattern for the tabernacle was disclosed, a portable sanctuary where God would reside among his population. Every detail was specified. The ark's dimensions that would contain the covenant tablets, the lampstand's design, the incense's composition, the garments the priests would wear. Nothing was left to chance or human innovation. This would be a dwelling location designed by the divine architect, a meeting location between heaven and earth. As days extended into weeks, the population waited below. Moses had left Aaron and Hur in charge, stating, "Wait here for us until we return to you. Whoever has a dispute may proceed to them." Yet Sinai's fire appeared to have consumed Moses. Doubt crept in like an evening chill. Perhaps he had perished in the divine presence. Perhaps they were abandoned in the desert without their leader. At the mountain summit, God inscribed the covenant on stone tablets with his own finger. Divine words created tangible. Below, terror was forging a very distinct kind of covenant, one that would test the newly formed bond between God and Israel to its breaking point. The mountain persisted to smoke. The thunder occasionally rolled. And in the camp below, impatience grew like a shadow as certainty's sun set. How rapidly slavery's mindset returns when freedom's route grows difficult. How easily divine absence is perceived when divine timing extends beyond human expectation. Yet through thunder and silence, through smoke and clarity, a covenant was being established that would endure for millennia. On Sinai, Egypt's slaves were becoming God's population, receiving not just laws, yet identity, not just commands, yet calling. The mountain's trembling would settle, the clouds would clear. Yet the words spoken there would echo through human history, shaping comprehension of justice, community, worship, and relationship with the divine. Part 18. The Golden Calf. As days extended into weeks, with no indication of Moses, unease spread through the camp like a desert wind. 40 days and 40 nights had elapsed, with the mountain still wrapped in cloud and smoke. The initial awe of God's presence had disappeared, replaced by uncertainty and terror. The population assembled around Aaron, Moses' brother, who had been left in authority, their voices urgent and demanding. "Arrive, create us deities who will proceed before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't recognize what has occurred to him." Their words disclosed how thinly their fresh faith rested upon them. Though they had observed Egypt's afflictions, walked through the divided sea, consumed bread from heaven, and drunk water from the rock, their hearts still hungered for something visible, something tangible. The God who had rescued them stayed too abstract, too hidden in cloud and fire. They required a God they could observe. Aaron, perhaps fearing the crowd or lacking courage to stand alone, yielded to their demand. "Remove the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me," he directed. The population readily removed their jewelry, collected from the Egyptians as they left, and brought it to Aaron. Obtaining this gold, he fashioned it into a calf, likely reminiscent of the Egyptian bull deity Apis, a symbol of strength and fertility. When the work was complete, the population exclaimed, "These are your deities, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Aaron constructed an altar before the golden image and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." They arose early the next day, presenting burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then they positioned down to consume and drink and arose up to engage in revelry, their worship degenerating into the sensual practices they had recognized in Egypt. Meanwhile, on Sinai's summit, God addressed Moses with urgency. "Descend, since your population whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been rapid to turn away from what I commanded them, and have created themselves an idol cast in a calf's shape." Notice the shift in language. No longer my population, yet your population. As though the covenant had already been severed by their infidelity. God's anger burned against this betrayal. "I have observed these people, and they are a stiff-necked population. Now leave me alone, so my anger may burn against them, and I may destroy them. Then I will create you into a great nation." Here was a divine test of Moses' own heart. Would he accept this proposal to become a fresh Abraham, the father of a nation born from his own lineage rather than from this troublesome population? Would he step aside and permit divine justice to take its course? Moses selected instead to stand in the gap. He appealed to God's reputation among the nations. Why should the Egyptians state it was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the earth's face? He reminded God of the promises created to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses didn't deny the population's guilt or minimize their transgression. He simply positioned divine mercy and covenant faithfulness above divine judgment. In response to Moses' intercession, the Lord relented and didn't bring on his population the disaster he had threatened. Mercy prevailed over judgment, yet accountability persisted. Moses descended the mountain, transporting the 2 covenant tablets inscribed by God's own finger. When he and Joshua drew near to the camp, celebration sounds drifted to their ears. With a warrior's sharp instincts, Joshua confused it for the clamor of warfare. Moses, on the other hand, understood it more precisely. This is not the sound of triumph. This is not the sound of loss. What I hear is the sound of singing. The moment Moses witnessed the calf and the dancing, fury ignited within him. From his hands he hurled the tablets, shattering them at the mountain's base. A striking visual representation of the covenant shattered by Israel's betrayal. He seized the calf, consumed it with fire, crushed it into powder, sprinkled it across water, and forced the Israelites to consume it. He then challenged Aaron, "What actions did these people take against you that caused you to guide them into such terrible sin?" Aaron's answer displayed frailty instead of malice. "Please, do not let anger consume you, my Lord. You understand how inclined these people are toward wrongdoing." He provided a ridiculous account of the calf's creation. "They handed me the gold, and I cast it into the flames. And this calf emerged, as if the idol had shaped itself without any effort from him. Moses positioned himself at the camp's entrance and proclaimed, "All who stand with the Lord, gather to me." The Levites assembled around him. Following Moses' directive, they moved throughout the camp from start to finish, executing approximately 3,000 individuals who had spearheaded the idolatry. The purge was harsh, though it also represented compassion. The minority perished so the majority could survive, allowing the covenant's restoration. On the following day, Moses went back to the Lord, presenting himself as a sacrifice for atonement. What a tremendous sin these people have enacted. Gods fashioned from gold, they have created for themselves. Yet now, I ask you to pardon their transgression. However, if you cannot, erase me from the record you have inscribed. Similar to Abraham negotiating on behalf of Sodom, similar to Christ himself, who would eventually shoulder the transgressions of countless others, Moses presented his own position before God as protection for his people. God's answer balanced both compassion and righteousness. Any person who has transgressed against me, that person I will erase from my record. The covenant would persist, though not without repercussions. A plague swept through the camp due to the calf that Aaron had constructed. Then God directed Moses, "Depart from this location, you along with the people you led from Egypt, and proceed to the territory I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." However, a crucial modification occurred. "Yet I will not journey with you, for you are a stubborn people, and I could annihilate you during the journey." Moses erected a tent beyond the camp, naming it the Tent of Meeting. Those seeking the Lord would travel there, distant from the contaminated camp. Whenever Moses stepped into this tent, the cloud pillar would lower and remain at the opening while the Lord communicated with Moses directly, as one converses with a companion. The people would position themselves at their tent openings and offer worship upon seeing the cloud. Within this holy location, Moses begged once more for God's presence. "Should your presence not accompany us, do not advance us from this place. In what manner will anyone recognize that you favor me and your people if you do not travel with us? What other factor will set me and your people apart from every other people across the earth's surface?" The Lord yielded. "The exact thing you have requested, I will perform, for I am satisfied with you and I recognize you by name." Moses pushed even further. "Show me your glory now," God responded. "All my goodness I will cause to move before you, and in your presence I will declare my name, the Lord. Yet my face you cannot witness, because no person may witness me and continue living." God positioned Moses within a rock's crevice, shielding him with his hand until passing by, permitting Moses to observe his back, though not his face. A limited disclosure of divine magnificence that represented all human weakness could endure. God commanded Moses to carve 2 fresh stone tablets resembling the initial ones. Upon them, "I will inscribe the words that appeared on the initial tablets that you shattered." The covenant would experience renewal, not due to Israel's merit, but because of God's unwavering love and Moses' relentless intercession. The Lord came down within the cloud and positioned himself with Moses, announcing his name. The Lord, the merciful and gracious God, patient and slow to wrath, overflowing with love and truth, extending love to multitudes, and pardoning wickedness, defiance, and transgression. Still, he does not permit the guilty to escape punishment. Upon this disclosure of divine nature, Moses prostrated himself and offered worship. He petitioned again for forgiveness concerning our wrongdoing and our transgression, and requested God to accept us as your inheritance. The covenant received renewal. God made promises once more to perform wonders unprecedented in any nation's history. He restated essential commands. Form no covenant with those inhabiting the territory. Demolish their altars. Offer worship to no other deity. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses stayed once more on the mountain without either nourishment or liquid. During this time, God inscribed the Ten Commandments upon the fresh tablets. When Moses descended from Mount Sinai carrying the restored covenant in his grasp, he remained unaware that his countenance glowed from conversing with the Lord. The people feared approaching him until he summoned them. From that point forward, Moses would place a covering over his countenance after delivering the Lord's messages to the people, removing it solely when entering to converse with the Lord once more. Through defiance, intercession, condemnation, and compassion, the covenant linking God and Israel had experienced fracture and repair, challenge and fortification. The golden calf remained as a cautionary symbol throughout generations regarding humanity's inclination to create gods matching our preferences instead of yielding to the God who created us. Still, it also bore witness to divine forbearance and the strength of devoted intercession. The tablets received restoration. The covenant was reestablished. The journey would press forward. Part 19. The Tabernacle and God's Presence. Moses assembled the entire Israelite gathering and communicated to them the Lord's directions for the tabernacle, a sacred place within their midst where divine presence would reside among them. The golden calf incident had exposed their requirement for tangible confirmation of God's presence, though on God's conditions, not theirs. The tabernacle would furnish this observable center while guiding their worship toward the unseen God. This represents what the Lord has directed. Moses commenced. Initially came the Sabbath directive. Even the holy labor of constructing God's residence must halt for the seventh day of rest. Following that, he described the materials required: gold, silver, and bronze, blue, purple, and crimson yarn, premium linen and goat hair, ram skins colored red and sea cow hides, acacia wood and olive oil, spices and incense, onyx, stones, and precious gems. These materials, numerous ones transported from Egypt as plunder, would undergo transformation from slavery's riches into worship's splendor. Moses summoned skilled craftsmen and artisans, all whose hearts inspire them to contribute, and all who possess willingness and whose hearts stir them. This sacred place would emerge not through force but through dedication, not through taxation but through liberality. The reaction surpassed all expectations. Each morning, the people delivered voluntary contributions. Such abundance accumulated that the craftsmen informed Moses, "The people deliver more than sufficient for completing the labor the Lord directed to be accomplished." Moses instructed the people to cease bringing additional offerings. Such was their enthusiasm to take part in fashioning a residence for God. 2 craftsmen received distinction through divine selection. Bezalel, son of Uri, saturated with the Spirit of God, possessing wisdom, possessing understanding, possessing knowledge, and possessing every variety of ability, along with his assistant, Oholiab, son of Ahisamach. God's Spirit enabled them for creative production, a signal that beauty and craftsmanship represent spiritual endowments alongside prophecy and guidance. Labor commenced following the design disclosed on Sinai. The tabernacle materialized as a mobile sanctuary engineered to be constructed, dismantled, and relocated as the people traveled. Its framework mirrored cosmic and theological arrangement. An exterior courtyard for all Israelites, followed by the holy chamber for priests, and ultimately the most holy chamber where the Ark of the Covenant would remain, divided by a substantial curtain. The Ark itself received fashioning from acacia wood covered with pure gold, possessing a lid designated the atonement seat, bordered by 2 golden cherubim with extended wings. It would contain the covenant tablets, a pot of manna, and eventually Aaron's staff that sprouted, representing law, provision, and priesthood. The ark symbolized God's throne, the tangible center of divine presence among the people. Standing before the curtain was the incense altar. Toward the south, the golden lampstand bearing its 7 lights, and toward the north, the table holding the bread of the presence. Every object possessed symbolic significance. Light eternally aflame before the Lord, bread perpetually in his presence, incense symbolizing the people's prayers ascending to heaven, Within the courtyard rose the burnt offering altar constructed of bronze instead of gold, where atonements would be performed for transgression and communion. Adjacent stood a bronze vessel where priests would cleanse themselves before accessing the tabernacle. The entire arrangement existed to instruct through symbolism and ceremony. Drawing near to God necessitated purification. Atonement came before communion, and God's sanctity required deep respect. The fabrics and protective layers received creation with remarkable ability. The innermost covering of premium linen featuring blue, purple, and crimson yarn decorated with cherubim, then coverings of goat hair, ram skins colored red, and resilient sea cow hides. The curtain dividing the most holy chamber displayed cherubim woven into it by a masterful craftsman, hanging from golden hooks upon 4 posts of acacia wood covered with gold and resting on silver foundations. Priestly vestments received preparation with matching attention for Aaron the high priest. An ephod fashioned from gold and premium twisted linen in blue, purple, and crimson, with shoulder components connected at 2 locations, and a breastpiece doubled over. Mounted in golden filigree, the breastpiece held 12 valuable stones, arranged in 4 rows, each carved with one tribe of Israel's name. The high priest would physically bear the people upon his shoulders and across his heart while entering God's presence. A blue robe, featuring bells and pomegranates alternating along its border. A turban bearing a gold inscription engraved "Holy to the Lord." Additional garments completed the high priest's ensemble. Vestments for Aaron's sons were less elaborate, though still fashioned with honor appropriate for their ministry. As every element reached completion, it was delivered to Moses for examination. The Israelites had accomplished all the labor precisely as the Lord had directed Moses. Moses examined the labor and observed that they had completed it precisely as the Lord had directed. Consequently, Moses pronounced blessing upon them. On the opening day of the opening month of the 2nd year following their departure from Egypt, Moses established the tabernacle. He positioned its tent across the framework, inserted the covenant tablets into the ark, arranged the bread upon the table, ignited the lamps, presented incense, offered burnt sacrifices, and positioned the vessel between the tent of meeting and the altar, filling it with liquid for cleansing. He anointed the tabernacle along with everything within it using sacred oil, dedicating it entirely to the Lord. He summoned Aaron and his sons to the opening, cleansed them with liquid, clothed them in their priestly vestments, and anointed them to function as priests. When everything reached completion following divine direction, the glory of the Lord saturated the tabernacle. The cloud enveloped the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord saturated the sacred place. Not even Moses could step inside because the cloud had descended upon it, and the glory of the Lord saturated the tabernacle. This observable expression of divine presence transformed into their compass through the wilderness. Whenever the cloud rose from the tabernacle, the Israelites would commence their journey. Should the cloud refuse to rise, they stayed in position. Thus it would remain throughout their expedition, the cloud of the Lord hovering over the tabernacle during daylight, and fire within the cloud during darkness, observable to all Israel. The tabernacle stood as evidence that God had not deserted them despite their transgression with the golden calf. It announced that holiness and compassion could coexist, that divine presence could remain among human frailty. It established sacred location and sacred moments in the shapelessness of the wilderness. Most significantly, it proclaimed that the God of the universe desired residence not in distant heavens, but among his people, a God who could be reached, though solely through the methods he instituted. Within this mobile sacred place, heaven contacted earth. The God who appeared remote on Sinai's peaks now resided in their midst, his presence traveling with them, directing them, staying with them through every phase of their wilderness expedition. The tabernacle transcended being merely a religious construction. It was the observable indication of covenant connection, the guarantee that they were not isolated in the enormous wilderness, that the God who had liberated them from Egypt would travel with them toward the promised territory. Part 20. Toward the promised land, a journey incomplete. The cloud of divine presence suspended above the finished tabernacle, observable to every individual in Israel's camp. During daylight, it manifested as a cloud pillar. During darkness, it converted into a fire pillar, projecting warm illumination across the tents. When the cloud ascended, the people understood it signaled time to continue their journey. When it descended, they understood to establish camp. Their wandering possessed divine guidance. Their apparently purposeless route followed heavenly direction. The book of Exodus approaches its conclusion with the tabernacle erected and the priesthood ordained. Still, the narrative remains incomplete. The Israelites had abandoned Egypt, physically traversing the boundary from slavery. However, Egypt had not completely abandoned them. They remained positioned between bondage and promise, no longer enslaved, though not entirely a nation, absorbing freedom's disciplines in wilderness seclusion. Their expedition would proceed through the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. 40 years of wandering for a generation incapable of releasing the slavery mentality. Only their offspring, born in liberty and molded by wilderness instruction, would ultimately traverse the Jordan into Canaan under Joshua's command. Moses himself would observe the promised territory from Mount Nebo, though would not step into it. His assignment fulfilled with the transmission of the law and the formation of covenant connection. The 40 years extended before them, years of examination and supply, of grievance and outcome, of defiance and renewal. At Kadesh Barnea, they would reach Canaan's threshold, dispatch 12 spies to investigate the territory, and subsequently withdraw in terror at accounts of fortified settlements and enormous occupants. We should select a leader and return to Egypt, they would declare, their hearts demonstrating greater attachment to recognizable bondage than to uncertain liberty. For this absence of faith, an entire generation would receive condemnation to perish in the wilderness, never witnessing the promise's realization. There would be Korah's uprising when a Levite and his supporters contested Moses' authority, only to witness the earth split beneath them in divine condemnation. There would be Moses' own instance of disobedience at Meribah's waters, striking the rock in frustration instead of addressing it as God instructed, an action that would deny him entrance into the promised territory. There would be the peculiar account of Balaam, compensated to curse Israel, yet forced by God to bless them alternatively. There would be the bronze serpent elevated on a pole, delivering healing to those who gazed upon it, following venomous snakes spreading throughout the camp. Throughout everything, God would maintain faithfulness to his covenant, correcting yet not deserting, permitting consequences though also supplying manna every morning and liquid from improbable sources. The wilderness wandering would demonstrate itself to be not solely a punishment, but additionally a testing ground of faith, a forge where an enslaved people could be transformed into a covenant nation. By the occasion, Moses gathered them on Moab's plains for his concluding addresses documented in Deuteronomy. The generation that had experienced Egyptian bondage had mostly disappeared. Before them stretched the Jordan River, and past it the territory promised to their forefathers. Behind them stretched 40 years of divine forbearance and supply, of human stumbling and discovering. Remember the manner the Lord your God guided you completely throughout the wilderness these 40 years. Moses would remind them, to humble and examine you for the purpose of understanding what resided in your heart, whether or not you would observe his commands. The narrative that commenced with slaves producing bricks in Egypt had metamorphosed into the narrative of a people positioned on the brink of inheritance, carrying the law of God and the tabernacle of his presence. The covenant formed at Sinai would direct their national existence for centuries ahead, molding their comprehension of justice, community, worship, and connection with the divine. The Exodus expedition carries deep meaning past its historical importance. It remains as an archetype of spiritual emancipation, the progression from bondage to liberty, from oppression to honor, from serving human overlords to serving the divine. It discloses a God who perceives the cries of the downtrodden, who intervenes in human chronicles, who creates and maintains covenant pledges. It depicts a people discovering that liberty brings obligation that connection with God necessitates both law and devotion, that the expedition from slavery to promise travels through wilderness examination. The wilderness itself surfaces as a potent symbol, not merely a geographical location, but a spiritual domain where former identities expire and fresh ones develop, where reliance on God substitutes self-reliance, where divine direction becomes more essential than human navigation. In wilderness locations, what appears like postponement or divine unavailability often demonstrates to be divine readiness. The incomplete character of Exodus reminds us that most meaningful expeditions develop across generations. The route from bondage to promise seldom traces a direct line. Liberty necessitates patience. Covenant communities develop gradually. Divine intentions often manifest themselves across decades instead of days. For us who receive this ancient narrative centuries afterward, these wilderness instructions still echo. We too recognize something of Egypt's bondage in our personal addictions and obsessions, our personal submission to forces that reduce instead of elevate our humanity. We too have undergone Red Sea instances when impossible obstacles separate before us. We too have experienced bitter liquids turn pleasant, discovered manna in desolate locations, liquid from rock-hard impossibilities. We too have constructed our golden calves pursuing tangible security instead of trusting the invisible God. And we too travel under the direction of divine presence through wilderness intervals that appear meaningless until examined in hindsight, toward promises whose realization may arrive only to generations that succeed us. The Exodus narrative transforms into our narrative, not merely ancient chronicles, but living story. Not merely what occurred to them, but what occurs to us. As the concluding words of Exodus diminish, the people remain in the wilderness, the expedition incomplete. The tabernacle rises complete at their camp center, the glory of the Lord filling it with palpable presence. The law has been delivered, fractured, and restored. The golden calf has disclosed their frailty. The tabernacle discloses God's unwavering devotion. They advance only when the cloud ascends. They pause when it descends. Their expedition persists, as all genuine expeditions do, one stride at a time, in faith instead of vision, toward a promise observed, though not yet seized. Sleep now and envision wilderness expeditions and promised territories, of clouds that direct during daylight and fires that warm during darkness, of a God who forms covenant with improbable people and maintains faithfulness even when they stumble. The narrative that commenced in bondage persists toward liberty. The God who existed, who exists, and who will exist travels alongside all who pursue the cloud of his presence toward the pledge of his word.